Well, welcome everybody. I'm Alon Cassuto. I'm CEO of the Zionist Federation, and it's a real pleasure and honor to welcome you to tonight's webinar. We're joined by some fascinating guests, which we'll get a chance to hear from. And really, we've got over 100 people who've joined us online and more joining by the minute. So the thinking behind tonight's webinar is that over the past 2 years, since the devastating events of October 7th, our collective minds across the Jewish world have been all consumed by everything that has been going on between Israel and its many enemies on multiple fronts. These, of course, include Iran and its many proxies of Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis, and others. And most of us have read and listened and watched so much content about Israel's various conflicts and the impact that that's had on our brothers and sisters in Israel. And of course, we've known it all too well here in Australia as well, that we know it intimately, we know it in our hearts, we feel it. And throughout this time, we've also known that there's been another front, and that for nearly 3 years, the war in the Ukraine has been, for over 3 years, the war in the Ukraine has been really devastating communities in the Ukraine and in Russia as well. And it's become a real test case for international order. It's become a test case for what happens when a sovereign country is invaded, how the world responds, how democracy and identity and resilience are really defended in real time. And for Jewish communities, it's touched something even deeper because we've seen Jewish Ukrainians fighting to defend their homeland, extraordinary humanitarian mobilization. And really, we've seen Israel play a role in this conflict. We've seen Jewish communities around the world play a role in this conflict. And at the same time, the war has changed geopolitical alliances, it's changed economic systems and the balance of power in Europe. There's been so much of a macro impact as well as at a very human level, a very micro impact on so many families and communities. And so our aim tonight is not to retell every detail, but rather to understand some of the forces that are shaping this war and the Jewish experience of this war. And that understanding is there really through a chance for us to engage in some good conversation and questions with experts on this matter. And that's why we've invited two experts to join us this evening. I want to open by saying that I'm not an expert on the war in the Ukraine, and this is really meant to be a conversation about peoplehood and about our community and the Jewish perspective on the war in the Ukraine as well. But I did think it would be helpful for us just to recap in just a few words the background to this conflict. And so for many years, the Ukraine has been an independent country. It's had its own language, its own culture, its own political direction. And in 2014, which now feels like somewhat of a lifetime ago, Russia annexed Crimea and supported separatist groups in parts of eastern Ukraine. And from that point until 2022, there was a low-level conflict in those regions, but the rest of the country remained under full Ukrainian control. Then in February of 2022, and we'll all probably remember this quite vividly, Russia launched a full-scale invasion of the Ukraine. And the initial phase was really fast and intense. Russian forces entered from several directions, and many expected Kiev to fall rather quickly. And instead, there was quite a surprise. Ukrainian defense proved far more resilient than was anticipated. And within weeks, Russia started withdrawing from Kiev and shifted its focus to the east and south of the Ukraine. And since mid-2022 onward, this war became one of attrition, this kind of grinding conflict where the Ukraine, with international support, attempted to push back Russian forces in several counteroffensives. Russia, on the other hand, consolidated control over certain parts of Donbass and other places, connecting mainland Russia to Crimea, and both sides were suffering very, very heavy losses, in fact, in the hundreds of thousands. By 2023 and 2024, the war had settled into this intense but relatively static front line where Russia continued to target infrastructure, where Ukraine relied heavily on Western aid, and millions of civilians who were displaced were living under this direct threat of war. Today, Russia controls roughly one-fifth of Ukraine's territory, and Ukraine continues to defend its sovereignty and independence while navigating all of the humanitarian, economic, and military pressures that come with this prolonged war that it did not want or expect. The wider world is, of course, deeply invested in this outcome, and we know that even though we see it on our news channels, it is this prolonged conflict that is getting less attention, for instance, than other conflicts in recent times, conflicts we know all too well. So tonight we are joined by two exceptional experts who've been on the front line of the Ukraine, have experienced it, have worked in it, have written about it, and have supported Ukrainian people directly. We've got Peter Shmigel, who's a writer, he's a social advocate, he's a political advisor, he's a celebrated CEO of nonprofits, and he's authored over 300 articles on the Ukraine, as well as the recent book, The Drone, which explores the human cost of war and what conflict means. We're also joined by Natalie Shnaiderman, who's the Director of Strategy and Partnerships, Aliyah and Integration at the Jewish Agency. Natalie has been leading the humanitarian efforts as well as the Aliyah partnership efforts, connecting the Jewish world and the communities in crisis in the Ukraine and in Russia. Before we invite Natalie and Peter, I do want to invite our very dear friend and guest, Gary Perlstein, who's president of UIA New South Wales, our wonderful partners in this event, to share a few words on UIA's efforts in the Ukraine. UIA are one of the first to respond and do incredible humanitarian work on the ground. So, Gary, welcome, and look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you, Alon. Just like you, we share a few things in common. One, that we're not experts on the Ukraine situation, but certainly joined at the hip and bound by the incredible work we do and the partnership that the Zionist Federation and UIA have here in Australia. And lovely to be in the presence of Peter and Natalie, and welcome to everybody as well. I'm so pleased that we're sort of refocusing some attention and some focus on the Ukraine-Russian situation, because I think it's so important. And on the ground, because of October 7, the absorption and looking after those who came to Israel has been more complex. So I think it's really good that we're revisiting this tonight, and I look forward to hearing from Peter and Natalie as well. Keren Hayesod UIA mobilized very swiftly, as Alon said, to have an emergency campaign as the war broke out, and we raised $23 million from 40 countries and 62 campaigns, which was a very large amount of money. It was there to facilitate the rescue flights, the buses and the logistics. I'm sure Natalie will speak to that. Transit facilities at the borders in Poland, Romania, Hungary, Moldova. I mean, hotels were transformed in Poland into safe havens. So there was a lot of work that required funds that needed financial assistance to individuals. Of the 75,000 immigrants that came to Israel in 2022, 44,000 were from Russia, 15,000 from Ukraine. And literally they had a small suitcase, little handbag. They left so quickly, mainly women with young children, elderly women. Men obviously had to stay in the army. And each and every one of these individuals is a person with a whole world around them, for those who we were responsible for, not to see them as just another number, but rather as individuals. And the care that the Jewish Agency for Israel gave to these people on the ground with our support and assistance was just incredible. This operation really did reinforce Keren Hayesod UIA's role that it plays in global Jewry. For more than 105 years, we have been there to rescue Jews who've needed to be from any community, wherever they were oppressed. And in Australia, we're the only organisation who is responsible for funding and supporting Aliyah in this way. We take this responsibility obviously very seriously, and the trust that our donors and those in all the countries around the world who support Keren Hayesod UIA, so much so that Stephen Lowy, who was our chairman at the time of the World Keren Hayesod Board of Trustees, he went straight to Ukraine to ensure that the funds were being remitted in an appropriate way, that there was efficacy, that there was governance, because we take this role and responsibility very, very seriously on behalf of our donors, because regrettably, there will be more operations globally. In fact, if I reflect over my 35 years of involvement in Keren Sod UIA, the amounts of times we've been briefed about contingency planning and scenario planning for communities that we would all be horrified to think would need a rescue and contingency plan. Sadly, today, with what we're seeing with the rising anti-Semitism, some of these countries are so close to home. So we will continue to do this incredible work with our wonderful partners, the Jewish Agency for Israel, and I just look forward to a very informative, insightful evening, and thank you very much to everyone.
Thank you so much, Gary, and we appreciate all the incredible work that UIA has been doing. I'm now going to invite Natalie and Peter to join me. So Natalie, Peter, welcome. Natalie is joining us from Israel. Peter is joining us from Adelaide, and we are delighted to have you. Peter, I'll invite you to just open by perhaps giving us a bit of context. So for those watching from their homes in Australia who have seen the reporting on the Ukraine, have read about it, what is it that is actually happening on the ground right now that might not be fully appreciated just from watching the news? How would you kind of paint the picture of what is actually happening day to day in life in the Ukraine?
Well, that's an excellent way to frame the discussion, Alon. And first of all, thank you to the Zionist Federation as well as to UIA for putting on this evening. It's wonderful that you're casting your attention on this other conflict that merits morally and strategically attention. So thank you. Look, where are we at? It's 4 years of war. And as was the case with the situation in Gaza, there's often a vast discrepancy between what you read in the newspapers and see on your television and the reality. And I think the Jewish community understands that better than anyone else. The misrepresentations, for example, that took place during the Gaza situation. For example, we often read that the war on Ukraine is a war of attrition at the moment, that conceptually you have one force faced off against another, and it's just this sort of arm wrestle day after day for literally square kilometers, square hundreds of meters of territory, almost a repeat of World War I, but using much more high technology. You know, that's partially true, but it's partially untrue. And I think guests would be interested to know that this war has become the world's first drone war. Ukraine is manufacturing 4.5 million drones in the following year. It's the world's largest manufacturer of drones. Why is it doing that? Because it understands, as its opponents understands, that wars are not decided by square hundreds of meters on the ground nowadays. They're decided, as all great conflicts are, by energy. Who has access to it, who loses it, et cetera, et cetera. So what the war is really about now is who can destroy the opponent's energy. The Russians are going after the day-to-day energy, if you will, of Ukraine. It's lighting systems, it's heating systems, and the Ukrainians on their part are going after the blood oil that fuels this entire conflict. And they've successfully destroyed about 35% of Russia's oil refineries to date. So when you read your next headline about this grinding, ceaseless, never-ending conflict, pause a moment and dig a little bit deeper and look at what's happening with drones and look about what's happening with energy. And there you'll get a different sense of momentum and direction.
Thanks, Peter. Natalie, I'm curious from your perspective if you could describe a bit about the Jewish life in the Ukraine today. So who is still there? Who's left? How are communities functioning under this constant grinding war and the drone warfare that Peter just described? And I'm curious, I mean, what's really changed for Jews in the Ukraine since 2022?
Sure. First of all, thank you for inviting me, Zionist Federation of Australia and UIA Keren Sod, and hello, everyone. Thank you for joining. I have to open and say that you need to know that most of Jewish community, of Jewish population in Ukraine state. I think this is the first statement I would like to make. So we estimate that of 200,000 Jews of Ukraine before the war. About 50,000 left. By now, 20,000 to Israel, made Aliyah, and 30,000 just spread through Europe, North America, and as you know better than me, to Australia for relocation, and they're well hosted by the local communities. Special note that many still are traveling. It's a very dynamic community who travels back and forth, especially those who stayed in Europe and Eastern Europe specifically. Also, another important note that half of Jewish community, as it was before the war, relocated internally to the western part and some to the central part. So new Jewish communities emerged, which has also shifted the way we work. Communities, adapted. Some communities definitely have emptied out. Some just left as communities, for example, from Odessa to Romania and then to Israel or to Vienna, Austria. And many just established new communities or joined others. So it's really a big shift. And again, they adapted. Synagogues and community centers operate in many cases as shelters. They deliver food, medicine, even now, not just in the first year of the war, because, when the winter is coming and more communities need generators. Many of them still, Ukraine still experiences a lot of electricity outages, and many of our communities offices, Jewish agency offices, work on due to generators. So with all their challenges and casualties, and people with limited, of course, mobility, we still keep going with the community overnight programs. We keep mostly hold in the Western Ukraine, which is relatively safer until the last shelling. But we try to keep the life, on with the camps, with their Hebrew classes, with their seminars, with their Jewish events and holidays, Independence Day celebrations, and even we invite, missions. We also hosted a few years ago a mission from UIA, Karen Isot, and we welcome you to join, safer areas in the Western Ukraine because they need our solidarity the most these days.
So Natalie, I want you to, for a moment, take us back to that first week of the war, those first crucial 72 hours where I think the whole world was in disbelief as we watched these really quite incredible images of, Russian forces moving towards the Ukraine. What did mobilization look like inside the Jewish agency across, the Israel and all of its various nonprofits that were active there in terms of the response, and what were some of the decisions that had to be made when potentially not all the facts were known, and there seemed to have been a lot of trepidation and uncertainty in the air. I'd love for you to just take us through those first early days.
Well, it was, of course, with all their expectation and information and intelligence everyone has, especially Jewish organizations, the Jewish agency, it was still very much unexpected. I think all were caught in big surprise because of the scale and the terrific and dramatic attack and total mass evacuation that started the first hours of the war, February 24th. We can't just forget it. The Jewish agency activated full emergency mode that morning, leveraging pre-existing infrastructure. And I think this is the most important point, that if we wouldn't have this infrastructure and coordination with all other Jewish organizations and our relationship with UIA and other Jewish philanthropic world, I think we wouldn't able even to deliver this help immediately at that day. So evacuation corridors, temporary shelters, non-stop bus convoys were established within really first days. We organized 450 buses, 218 flight chapters from all the borders, and opened more than 20 transit centers. So the first days is about evacuation, help people just, come close, escape to their border. I personally coordinated evacuation WhatsApp groups, connecting families in the shelters with the bus drivers or just drivers of private cars with all the Jewish organizations. We had a coordination table, bringing them to the border and spreading them, settling them to the shelters. It was something that we cannot forget. And again, thanks for the partnership and support you.
Thanks, Natalie. Yeah, Peter, something that really, I think, surprised so many across the world was just how resilient the Ukrainians were and how successful they were in pushing back on what seemed to be this enormous, force that the Russians invaded with. And I'm curious, you've obviously written about this extensively, but what's behind this? Firstly, the courage and resilience, and also this ability to surprise the world, really, in being able to withstand this offensive.
What an interesting question. I think there's at least two explanations for it. The first is Ukrainians, like Jews, know how to suffer. They've had an extraordinarily bloody history. They've had terrible neighbors, which many Jews in Israel can relate to. And as a result of that, there have been any number of different sequences through history where they've had to resist. And this is by no means their first need to defend themselves against invading imperialist forces. So I think there's some cultural DNA there that kicks in terms of being stoic and being persevering against the odds, if you will, against overwhelming force. I think the other part of it is a belief in values, right? So whether you're talking about ethnically Ukrainians or ethnically Russian Ukrainians or Jewish Ukrainians or non-Jewish Ukrainians, what is the unifying theme that makes them stand up against highly trained Russian paratroopers only with Molotov cocktails? I think it's because they believe in democracy dearly. They believe in being part of Europe dearly. They believe in the international rules-based order dearly. And when you have strong beliefs, you can withstand some of the most brutal acts in history. So I would explain it that way.
And Peter, are there any individual acts of courage that you've witnessed or that you've written about that really stand out for you, that kind of encapsulate this national character that you speak of?
Yeah, there are many, and one in particular, I think, illustrates this phenomenal resilience and bravery, but it also points to what I believe is a huge milestone in the relationship of Jews and Ukrainians and the way that has evolved to a very different level during this conflict. None of us can ignore a horrible and bloody history, a history that's filled with anti-Semitism. But we should also take note of the fact that there has been great healing in the last 30 years of independence. And in some respects, that healing has progressed during the war, fascinatingly. I take you to Dr. Maya Mendel. Dr. Mendel is a pediatric clinician in Kherson. Her city was occupied for about 6 months at the beginning of the war. Dr. Mendel is a woman of Jewish background. Her daughter was, in fact, the spokesman to President Zelensky at one point, and we know the president's background, of course. Dr. Mendel was on her ward in her clinic when they received several visits from the Russian secret services from the FSB. And why those secret services were there was they were essentially scoping out how many different wards of the state were in the clinic, how many kids who were involved somehow with social services were in the clinic. Why? Because it's those kids that the Russians physically kidnap and take out of Ukraine for what they openly call re-education. It is an ethnic cleansing program at the generational level, pure and simple. Dr. Mandel witnessed these officers poking around her ward, and she literally physically put herself between Russian Secret Service officers, ex-KGB men, and those children. She saved an entire ward's worth of kids from being kidnapped into Russia. And again, how do you explain this? A, her home is Ukraine and she defends it. B, I would suggest that part of that tradition of bravery comes from her Jewish soul. That incredible toughness against the odds that for me is part of what I think is most remarkable about Judaism and about Jews.
I mean, Peter, as you speak about Dr. Mendel and how she rescued, this whole generation of young Ukrainian children, I can't help but think of the parallels about stories of Janusz Korczak and others through the Holocaust who also saved hundreds and thousands of Jews, and there are so many of them. And really, that's something that I'm curious about, which is for this generation of Ukrainian children, and to an extent, Russian children who've been so shaped by this war. What is, I mean, obviously there's going to be so much trauma and pain and suffering and healing that has to come off the back of it. But how do parents and communities continue to try and function during this time when really their country has in many parts been ravaged by war? There's been displacements. How do schools go on? How do communities go on? How do families continue to live? I mean, I'm curious of some of the people you've been in contact with, both you and Natalie, and what they're saying about daily life.
Yeah, there's an expression in Ukraine that each must fight his own front or her own front. And the way that gets translated to reality is many everyday Ukrainians, their resistance to invasion, their war is essentially to be normal, to maintain as much normalcy as possible, even when you're being bombed every night, even when you have news from the front that a cousin, a brother, a relation, a friend has died in battle, that somehow you have to overcome that sort of violent mentality and just maintain as much normalcy as you can, particularly for your kids. And one of the ways it takes interesting form, this adapted life that they call it, is things go underground, literally. I remember sitting in an underground shelter with a group of young boys playing, believe it or not, that most Australian of sports, rugby league in Kiev, and talking about the Penrith Panthers and talking about the fact that Nathan Cleary has Ukrainian background. And sure enough, we were inside this bunker because there was an air raid siren going on overhead. And as soon as the air raid siren turned off, the boys finished up their little chess games that they were playing and went out and they practiced rugby league. So it's through these small battles for normalcy that the bigger battle over tyranny is won.
Natalie, how about you in terms of some of the communities and families you've been speaking to? What are they saying about how life is, and especially ones who, probably had to spend years away from their home and where they grew up and were raising their families? What's it like for them?
Well, their families are still separated in Ukraine. Many of them, some left, some stayed, some turned back. So it's a lot of dynamics in terms of travel. You can see a lot of families, members of the families, friends. They're all travel. They're all connected. Some experienced even, 7th of October in Israel. So it's a war in a sequence. from Odessa to Ashkelon, I have friends, and we have a lot of staff, volunteers. As Peter said, it's an emergency routine, as we call it, also in Israel. I was in Kiev a month and a week ago, experiencing a siren, like an air alarm, and in the middle of in Kiev, we just all, like in Israel, went to their parking lot. Some, acts very indifferent. Some, I didn't see fear in the eyes of people because this is how they keep going on. They're all very, I felt a high level of solidarity. Jewish community with Ukrainians who are really support each other and really share as much as possible any arrangements, or when we support building bomb shelters for schools. So like in Israel, they just they hold their activities in the bomb shelter. And this is like a new normal, something that they still keep going on. But I think the most important thing here is that they know that we are here, for them. Jewish community around the world, as much as we can show them that we didn't forget about them. With all the emergencies, anti-Semitism, 7th of October in Israel, and still a war situation in Israel, we never forgot them. We're still together, we care about them, and as much as possible, really, to connect with them. That is super helpful.
Thanks, Natalie. Natalie, in a moment, I'm curious to ask you a bit more about Aliyah and absorption, but I want to take a moment to remind the over 130 people who've joined us from across Australia that you have the opportunity to also ask questions, which is through the Q&A function of the webinar. So if you click on Q&A, you can then ask a question, and that will be put to our panelists as well. So please feel free to ask some questions. Natalie, I'm curious how the evacuation in Aliyah has really evolved from that early emergency where there was just a need to be able to move people to safety into a longer term framework for absorption and integration for those who've chosen to make Israel their new home.
So the first year, more than 15,000 Ukrainian Jews made Aliyah, which is, comparatively to like between 2 and 3,000 Jews from Ukraine make Aliyah usually in our good days. So it's many more. And the same year, more than 43 times more, like 46,000 Russian Jews made Aliyah the same year. Also at the same year had other Aliyah rescue operations in Ethiopia and other areas. So it was a very challenging year for the changes and of course for the government. So the government was helpful with just really making easier the process of Aliyah and documents. People came to the borders with nothing. Most of them just didn't take any documents. So the government really, it was an exceptional problem one time. Exception. They approved, received the documents through the copy, sent through their mobile phone, which is like never happened before, and I'm not sure it will happen again. But it was an amazing help for these people. So those who wanted to make Aliyah, they made Aliyah, and we opened more than 20 absorption centers here and rented hotels together with the government and philanthropic help with UIA and other philanthropists. Just we tripled and even multiplied by 5 all our programs for youngsters, those who wanted to leave before they're drafted. So we had to really triple all our programs, especially for youngsters, and of course for women with children who are left their men, loved ones. They're still not allowed to leave Ukraine. here to really offer them vocational training programs with Hebrew. We had to multiply all our Hebrew instruction as it was in 90s. So that a very, very challenging year. But these years it's already like more organized corridors. We support mostly programming, housing programming everywhere we can. More in the center and south of Ukraine, of course, Western Ukraine, which is safer, less bombed, less in the east, which is still very challenging to hold any activities there. We try to bring as many, community members as possible to their respites. And really, we work a lot on mental health. Both our activity, members, but also volunteers and staff. We coordinate a lot of efforts with other Jewish organizations and Israeli organizations, Coalition for Trauma in Israel. They work and they actively involved in the work on mental health, sharing their experience from Israel to Ukraine.
Natalie, I was interested in, you shared something quite extraordinary the other day when we spoke, which is that in fact, at certain periods, there were more Russians making Aliyah than there were Ukrainians. And I'm curious, firstly, how are Russian Jews dealing with this protracted war? And then what is the dynamic between Russian and Ukrainian Jews when they find themselves living in Israel side by side?
Well, there's still Russians making more Aliyah than Ukrainians on any other Jewish person in the world. This is just statistics. They are actively escaping our Russian regime, and I think it says a lot. It actually, stands for the statement that they are escaping. So in the first year was a lot of tension in Israel. It was obvious. Many Russian Jews really feel guilt or fear because there's limited, personal freedom in Russia. So it's a matter of education. They just prefer not to speak freely, even if when they're in Israel, they still prefer not to share openly. They feel also personally attacked for a war they never supported. I mean, most of them, at least those who are made Aliyah. But with the time, we also organize joint groups with a lot of psychological help and guidance to the groups. And, life is stronger than any political situation. So we see a lot of specifically Russian Jews who are active for Ukrainian support in Ukrainian-based here initiatives and volunteers. So I think that these days it's a bit more balanced. As many people, as many opinions, but I think we found a way to make them feel more shared and more common. Not just challenges, but also Jewish pride, Jewish identity, Israel causes, especially after October 7th. So it makes easier for them, to deal with the conflict back to home.
I actually think that Natalia is being a little too humble because the Jewish humanitarian efforts weren't limited to Jews. So I saw for myself standing on the border of Ukraine and Poland in the early days of the war, as there are literally rivers and rivers of refugees coming across that border, that amongst the little kiosks that were giving out physical aid, dog food, mobile phones, clothing, chips for the kids, every basic need was being met as those refugees were coming across that border. Who was most prominent? There were Jewish aid organizations. It was not about whether people were Jewish or Ukrainian. Jewish aid organizations were there, and that commitment to service, we see in Ukraine in other ways too. So, for example, we can't have this session without talking about the chief rabbi of Ukraine. The chief rabbi of Ukraine puts himself in all the worst places at all the worst times in Ukraine. Every time there's a terrible disaster, sure enough, there's the chief rabbi acting in solidarity, giving out aid, organizing relief, etc. And sure enough, the horrible old saying, no good deed goes unpunished. You know, the chief rabbi has suffered the loss of his own son as a frontline soldier. So again, here's an individual story that I think illustrates a new level in the relationship between the Jewish population of Ukraine and the quote unquote Ukrainian population of Ukraine. There's a fundamental transformation happening, and for me, it's happening because it's a simple case of a democratic force standing up against a dictatorial authoritarian force.
And Peter, on that, there's a few questions from those who've joined us who are understandably skeptical about this new shift, given Ukraine's anti-Semitic history and many of the pogroms, which have become really ingrained in the Jewish psyche around the world. It was really the Ukraine saw some of the worst precursors to, I suppose, the Holocaust, and in fact, many of the Zionist leading thinkers were prompted to become such ardent advocates for Zionism because of what they saw in the Ukraine. And so, one of the questions is, um, given this ugly history towards Jews, what are the current levels of anti-Semitism, and to what extent is this a long-term shift in your view, or potentially, a momentary shift of during war of unity and appreciation towards Jews that may not survive long term?
I would call it not just a sad history, I'd call it a deplorable one. Um, whether it was Shoah and collaboration during Shoah, or going back to the 18th century and the pogroms that were committed, etc., during that time, as you say, that led to some of the beginnings of the Zionist movement itself. But you're also talking to somebody whose father's first job was as Shabbos goy in his hometown. These communities lived side by side for hundreds of years in relative cooperation and peace, as much as there were instances of very hateful, deplorable violence by Ukrainians against Jews. Does anti-Semitism still exist in Ukraine? Yes, it does. It exists in Ukraine as it does in Australia.
Yeah.
Has there been progress? I'd suggest that over the last 30 years, the progress has been completely significant. And sometimes we throw this out as a way of arguing against people who cast allegations of current anti-Semitism. But there is simply no denying the fact that President Volodymyr Zelensky is a man of Jewish background. There's simply no denying that a society could elect someone of Jewish background. Says a lot about how much healing has actually taken place. I have stood with young Jewish men at the front, who have basically said they identify with this country, they identify with its values. Yes, they acknowledge anti-Semitism, but there is a larger project underway here. To a very significant degree, and Natalia can comment on this a lot, it's generational. There's an older sort of notion around Jewish-Ukrainian dynamics, and there's a younger sort of notion around Jewish-Ukrainian dynamics. And, I'm hopeful that younger notion can continue along its current trajectory. And that's towards, yes, greater Ukrainian atonement. For example, Babin Yar is an absolute disaster in terms of what goes on there on a commemorative basis. It's a disgrace, and it needs to be improved. But on the other hand, I see these young people and their relationships with each other, and you can only be extraordinarily hopeful.
Thanks, Peter. Peter, I'm actually, Natalie, one of the questions from those who've joined us is around Russian Jewish leaders and rabbis in particular who've been publicly very quiet following the invasion and the conflict from the Russian side, and the effect that it's having on fellow Jews. And I'm curious, what is life like for Jewish leaders in Russia, for those trying to maintain a semblance of Jewish life in Russia? How complicated is it to be Jewish in Russia, to speak up in Russia, and to even, I suppose, operate as Jewish organizations and entities in Russia as well?
So it's, I think, these 3.5, almost 4 years are probably the most difficult that I remember working in Russia, and I remember from 90s. So those who worked in 70s, maybe 80s, they can identify with the process that Russian Jewish community is going through, but you're limited to everything. So if you're strongly opposed, you just leave, and the borders are open. Unless, again, it was different ways of draft, military draft, and not everyone was able to leave, but it's not as intense like in Ukraine. People still can leave Russia. So those who stay, and many leaders are, so many leadership, by the way, from Ukraine and Russia, many prominent leaders just left. They work remotely. They didn't leave their responsibilities, but they're not there. The same like Russia and Ukraine. But in Russia, those who felt that their commitment is stronger than their other beliefs, they have to comply with their regime, with their regulations. And there are a lot of regulations. Your freedom is extremely limited. We, the Jewish Agency, rebuilt all our infrastructure. We just cannot really publish and advertise openly. We cannot, show and depict as many Israeli even signs as it used to be before the war. We need to mind our language. Also very specifically, sensitively speak about October 7th. So if you want to operate, and we definitely want to connect with and stay and support Russian Jews who are not in the easiest situation. Not everyone can live, as we can imagine. So it's a big community, more than 400,000 eligible for Aliyah in Russia. And we are being very, low profiled and helping with Aliyah and with Jewish programming, with other Jewish organizations on terms of that are, okay with the government. This is the only way to stay there and continue maintaining Jewish life. We just need to be smart. As we say in Hebrew, to be smart and not right.
Thanks, Natalie. I remember very intimately the Aliyah in the 90s from the former Soviet Union and the Olim who came when I was in primary school in Israel. And I remember between when I was in grade 1 and grade 4, there was, suddenly I went from having 1 or 2 young Jews from the former Soviet Union to maybe half the class being from the former Soviet Union at a certain point. And I remember going and greeting them in the absorption center, which was something that I did with my mother. And I'm curious, how different is absorption and Aliyah today compared to in the 90s? And in what ways is it easier? In what ways is it potentially more difficult?
I think both as Israeli, as a former new immigrant in the 90s, the same frameworks that you mentioned, and as a professional as of today, I think Aliyah and integration, absorption process is much easier these days for a few reasons. First of all, Israelis perceive new immigrants differently these days. They understand, and we experienced anti-Semitism. Those Israelis didn't know what anti-Semitism is. And these days, it's different. So they appreciate, Olim, new Israelis coming even these days during this terrible year for us. We had 2 terrible years, but this year we also had Iranian attack. We had Olim. We had Olim until now almost 20,000, even during the war, volunteers, lone soldiers. So this shared destiny, this shared effort, this shared rehabilitation and revival effort, I think really enormously united new immigrants and Israelis. These days, I think new immigrants become Israelis much quicker. They just have to be part of their community, and they began volunteer very quickly. Something that in our years, 90s or 2000s, were very much separated from Tzabrim, from Israelis. The programs were very isolated. These days, we try to integrate, to tailor personally according to the interests and the skills that Olim can come to Israel.
Yeah, thanks, Natalie. Peter, I want to take us back for a moment to a question that I posed to Natalie earlier about the dynamic between Ukrainians and Russians in Israel. And I'm curious if you were to look at the same dynamic in Australia between Russian and Ukrainian communities, or in other diasporic communities in America, Europe, other places around the world. What is it like for these two communities when they are in other places? Do they still hold on to, I suppose, that kind of nationalistic tribal nature? Do they integrate? What is the nature of those dynamics?
Well, that's an interesting question. I try not to do much diaspora in politics, if you will. My focus is in Ukraine, on Ukraine, as a journalist. But I can offer a few comments, and that is, unlike the situation that we saw with Gaza, which is essentially, in the Australian context, a failure of multiculturalism, a situation where certain members of the community, in a hateful way, have tried to import a radical, horrible, extremist ideology. Multiculturalism has largely succeeded when it comes to the Russian-Ukrainian conflict. I can think of only one instance where there was more than one instance, but one very ugly instance where there was a flare-up. It was back in 2015, where the Ukrainian Catholic Church in Lidcombe was desecrated by people who we know who they are. One of them happens to be now self-incarcerated in the Russian consulate in Sydney, Mr. Simeon Boykov. But I would say that Mr. Boykov and his strange little group of self-proclaimed Cossacks, whatever they are an exception rather than a rule. Both the Ukrainian community and, if I can briefly speak on their behalf, the Russian community, have been very measured about the conflict. Sure, we have our views. Sure, we participate in various programs. We participate in various initiatives, et cetera, et cetera. But yeah, speaking as a former chief of staff to a minister for multiculturalism here in New South Wales, I think we should be proud, at least in the case of this conflict, that we have decided that the things that unite us in Australia are more important than the things that divide us back in Eastern Europe.
Thanks, Peter. As we kind of near an end of this wonderful conversation, one question that is on my mind, but I can see it's also been brought up by Shoshana, who's joined us from the audience, which is, how does this all end, both in terms of how you think it will end and what your hopes and aspirations would be for how this ends. So I'm curious to hear from both of you on that.
Natalia?
Well, it's a $1 million question these days, how it will end. So I can imagine, based on all the information, with the Israeli agencies here, I believe that it would be some kind of agreement, probably not the best for both sides. Probably both sides will not be, none of them probably, most likely will be happy, but it will be some agreement. Not sure it will be very quickly. I know that we are anticipating some involvement and some development. We want to be ready this time. If agreements is signed in the next few months, there is a chance. We want to be ready for a big wave of, and the borders are open, big wave of Aliyah from Ukraine, those who couldn't leave, and maintain the activities, maintain programs for them, and we have registration lists for those who want to leave. Some will go back from Europe and other countries to Ukraine, on the one hand. And on the other hand, we anticipate revival of Jewish life. There will be always Jewish community in Ukraine, and I think it's something that we need to support as much as possible. It will reshape. It will look different. Maybe it will shrink, but it will be more open. It will never go back to where it was. This is, I believe, it will be more, Western oriented, more understanding, more flexible at some point before the war. With more relationship and programs and different partnerships in the world. It won't be easy, it won't be perfect, that's for sure. But I think that the resilience that this community, and not just Jewish, but Ukrainian community showed, I think this is the achievement. Not the numbers, not the facts, who stayed where, the new communities and new groups. The resilience is there. Nobody will take resilience from Ukrainians. I think in that case, in this sense, they won.
Thank you so much. Truly wonderful to hear from you both. You've offered so much depth and insight. We've covered so much in just over a short hour, and I really want to thank you both. It's always fascinating when there's a topic that on the one hand can feel so distant, but is anything but distant, because these are our, we spoke about the Russian Jewish community, the Ukrainian Jewish community, the Israeli, Russian and Ukrainian communities now, and as well as the Australian ones. And so really it is part of our extended family. It is all around us. And the war in the Ukraine, I think, is a reminder that the world that we live in isn't shaped by headlines. It's shaped by humans, by families, by communities that are impacted by these choices of nations and these enormous macro geopolitical machinations that are happening. But at the end of the day, it's humans like us who are impacted. And the questions that we've asked have been very much about that human experience. And I think for Jewish communities, we've heard from both of you how there is just so much of the Jewish character that by extension has become in part some of the Ukrainian character that has been really hardened by that adversity and those generations of conflict, and really that resilience and solidarity that we have come to appreciate about Israelis over the past 2 years, and how extraordinary they have been in the face of this multi-front war that they never wanted and they wish was over, before it started, and yet look at how Israel has fared in terms of its strength and solidarity as a result of it. And it reminds us that, it's a similar experience in the Ukraine. Of course, this situation, remains fluid, remains complex, remains deeply human. And for us, really, I think that the job is to stay informed, to stay curious, to stay connected, and to remember that behind these machinations of crazy, dictatorial and imperialistic ambitions are humans, both on the Ukrainian side, but also on the Russian side. And I think that's important for us to remember that the people in Russia are not necessarily aligned to these wars that the leader has dragged them into. And I think that's always helpful to remember as well about the complexity of what might be going on inside each of these nations. So Peter and Natalie, thank you so much for being a part of this conversation. Thank you, Gary, for opening so gracefully as well, and for the work that the UIA does. I also want to thank Anna Melis, who is from our Kangaruski team at the ZFA, our Russian-speaking division, who does incredible work with Russian-speaking Jewish communities and youth, and runs camps and programs and events for the Russian-speaking community all across Australia, in Sydney and in Melbourne. And Anna is really the visionary behind tonight's webinar. It was her idea to make this happen. She was the one who introduced Natalie and Peter to us. So Anna, thank you so much for this wonderful idea. I'm so glad that you brought it to us. And thank you so much to everyone who joined us from various parts across Australia. And we look forward to the next conversation. And have a wonderful evening and great week ahead.